results that matter and political reaction live through the night now on BBC One. Elections 2024.
Good evening. Within the next few months, there'll be a general election. You will choose who leads the country for the next 5 years. But millions of you in England and Wales have been voting today to decide who's in charge of bins, care and crime where you live. Those decisions make a huge difference, but the results will give us a massive indicator of our politicians' fortunes as we hurtle towards the big contest. The Prime Minister's tried to look cheerful on the campaign, but he's been under the cosh for many months. If the results are gruesome, could Rishi Sunak's job even be at risk? Will Sir Keir Starmer be able to show convincing progress tonight? Labour's been miles ahead in the polls for months, but it's real-life votes that really matter. Ed Davey and his army of Lib Dem activists want to call time on the Tories, but in how many parts of the country will they actually get their way? Thousands of council seats are up for grabs. There's a by-election in Blackpool. Police commissioners are being chosen too, and there are elections for those powerful mayors around the country. It adds up to the biggest test of public opinion before the general election. And Reeta Chakrabarti will bring us the numbers as the hours tick by.
These are the seats that the main parties are defending. Just under 1,000 for the Conservatives and for Labour, just over 400 for the Liberal Democrats. Counting overnight are 641 local council seats on 35 English councils. There'll be 3 police and crime commissioners and also that House of Commons seat of Blackpool South. I'll be bringing you the results and looking at the figures and the trends behind them.
Of course, the nation's number cruncher, Professor Sir John Curtis, will explain how the landscape is shaping up. And our political editor, Chris Mason, will tell us what that could mean. Top politicians from the parties will be with us in the studio with smiles or perhaps brave faces as the night goes on. So stay with us for election night on the BBC. The results are about to start coming in. A very warm welcome to election night on the BBC. Now, there is a dizzying array of contests to keep our eyes on. Each race, of course, important in its own right. But in this feverish atmosphere in the months before a general election, the overall picture we can build as the night goes on is so vital. Now, there are 2 things we have to bear in mind. The last time these seats were up was in 2021, when Boris Johnson was in charge. And it's not so much election night, but election 48 hours. It's going to take a while for all of the results to come in. So we'll know a lot by 6 a.m. and the end of our time together, but not everything. One of the most important races, though, is the by-election result at Blackpool South. We'll be there on the ground in a few minutes, and we will have that result this evening. We'll, of course, be right round the country with our colleagues at Counts. And at the desk with us for the first part of the night, the Cabinet Minister, Chris Heaton-Harris, for the Conservatives, Bridget Phillipson, who wants to be Labour's next Education Secretary, and Munira Wilson, her opposite number in the Liberal Democrats. I wonder who's feeling nervous and who's feeling chipper. But first off, let's start with our political editor, Chris Mason. And just as we look at pictures of what's starting to come in Blackpool South, talk to us first about what is at stake here for the Prime Minister and his Conservative colleagues.
For the Prime Minister, it is all about managing, in the short term at least, to convince his own MPs that he is definitively the person to take their party into the general election. Because for those small number of quite vociferous Conservative MPs who are not of that view, they acknowledge privately this is the last opportunity that they will have, if the results are poor, bad for the Conservatives, to convince their colleagues that this might be the moment to make a move. They acknowledge that they will have a persuasion job to do that because of the magnitude, the nuclear option of yet another change of Prime Minister. But that's what's at stake here in the very short term for the Prime Minister, because it's that last chance before the general election for those who would like to see a change to make that argument and try and convince their colleagues of the merits of that argument as they see it.
So if by Saturday afternoon it looks really gruesome, then the jeopardy is massive for Rishi Sunak. Let's then think of the Labour Party, and we're seeing the count in Hartlepool. Now, in 2021, the Tories won the by-election there, hugely successful for Keir Starmer and his colleagues. What does he have to show in places like that?
Hartlepool is fascinating because it is a case study in political change in relatively short term over the last 3 years. So I remember being there actually at the Hartlepool by-election. Labour lost. Boris Johnson was in his pomp. There was a giant inflatable of Boris Johnson that was sort of paraded through the town on the day, and Keir Starmer
rolling their eyes there at that particular memory.
and Keir Starmer was in real trouble. And actually, we've learnt since in a biography by Tom Baldwin, former Labour communications director, former journalist, that Keir Starmer that weekend came close to resigning as Labour leader. That's how imperilled he was by that result. And at the same time, in that wider region, the Tees Valley, the Conservatives won the mayoral race there by a million miles, more than 70% of the vote. So it's an indicator of how political fortunes have shifted in the last few years.
And for tonight, for the Labour Party, they are looking not just at something that looks credible, but something that looks really convincing. We're seeing pictures there of Rushmore in Hampshire. Now, a council in Hampshire, which might have seemed unimaginable a few years, that is in Labour's sight. So the whole picture for Labour, what do they want to happen?
They've got to be able to convince themselves and then shape a conversation that implies that they are en route to winning a general election. We've seen opinion polls, haven't we, for months on end, with Labour a million miles ahead. But we should always emphasise the colossal mountain that Labour are trying to climb at that general election. And as any politician will acknowledge, opinion polls, of course they matter and they shape the mood, but real votes in real ballot boxes really matter. How does geographically the results tonight match, and this is the same for all of the parties, match the key seats come the general election? Interestingly, from Labour this evening, their absolute emphasis is on Blackpool South, that parliamentary by-election, which they think they're going to win, and the council elections, they are emphasising less the mayoral contests. Conservatives equal and opposite on that, with them leaning into pointing at those mayoral contests as something they say suggests that their fate is perhaps not as grim as some might have feared.
Now, a bit later, I want to ask you about the smaller parties, because local elections are really important for them. But